you. Doctor, before the lunch adjournment, I was asking you some questions about a document. It was a document behind tab 416 that was up on the screen at the time. And I'd asked you some questions about the auxiliaries office and the distinction between auxiliaries and volunteers. Now, you can see this is a document dated the 1st of July 1999, so about a year and a half after the allegations were made. And this was about a year and a half after you'd informed Mr Purcell that his services were no longer required.
Yes.
You can see from the paragraph there that, well, you can see first of all that it's addressed, the letter is addressed to Tony Brown, the Network Executive Director. Can you tell the Commission who that person is?
Yes, there were 3 executives, well, 4, counting myself. He was one of the other 3 second-tier executives. So he was a former director of human resources, and due to the involvement of various things, he became one of the executive directors of the whole network. So he had responsibility for the HR and corporate functions in the Women's and the Children's Hospital at that time.
Right. So do you consider that it's likely that it was his role within HR that is the reason this letter was sent to him?
I believe so.
And is it HR that also has access to the register of volunteers that you referred to earlier?
Well, I think the register would have been actually kept very meticulously in the volunteers area rather than kept in HR, the truth be known.
So it's a register only accessible to the volunteer department?
I actually don't know, but that's what I would expect, because it was kept to manage the volunteers by the chief volunteer, so it would be appropriate that that information was kept near to the manager of volunteers, but I have no document about that.
Mm-hmm. And are you aware of whether there's any register in relation to people who are auxiliary members?
No, I'm not aware of any register of auxiliary members. These are the ones outside the hospital. They would be quite numerous and not constant, very likely, and be based all over the state of Victoria.
And why is it that you say that they're not constant?
Oh, well, let's take, for instance, a country town. There would be groups and families from time to time would be involved, likely through some personal relationship with a family or a family with a sick child to support that function. So that, as with many community groups, people's interests waxes and wanes, and so that there would be, as families become involved and their friends become involved, other families would fall off. So I imagine that though the leadership of various auxiliaries would likely be quite constant because of a drive of a single person, the membership of auxiliaries would vary over time, I suspect.
The letter itself is written on Royal Children's Hospital letterhead and has its address Flemington Road, Parkville, Victoria. Is it the case that the administrative base of this auxiliary office is physically at the hospital?
I believe so.
Okay. Now, just looking at the contents of this letter, it's been sent to Tony Brown and it's been sent by Sally Watson, who is the auxiliaries coordinator. And in this letter she said, "It's been brought to my attention that one of our auxiliary members, Harry Purcell, has overstepped the mark. Robin Griffiths, the volunteer coordinator, rang me rather concerned that Harry had accessed the ward area by stating that he'd been given permission by one of my staff." Now, you've just said in your evidence that auxiliary members are in more remote areas
Yes.
rather than being in the hospital. Can you explain this observation that's been made here?
Well, it reflects on Harry that the auxiliary members have no role in the hospital at all. Their role, as we've discussed, is outside the hospital raising funds. So it is inconsistent that he should turn up and lie to someone that he'd been given permission by the auxiliaries to turn up, and it was clearly recognised as something that was not appropriate and had no standing and made no sense to the people who have, in the two sentences you just read out. He had, auxiliary members had no role in the hospital. They had no lanyards and no passes and all the paraphernalia that go with working in a hospital. And this person has, by the looks of it, lied his way in, pretending that he had permission when those in charge recognised that he didn't have permission, because he couldn't have permission, because that's not the sort of thing that auxiliary members do. And he was found out.
Yes. In the following sentence it says, this being not true and due to Harry's history, which is obviously not conducive to understanding his boundaries within the hospital, I've taken the matter in hand on the auxiliary side of things. Now, do you have any information or memory or understanding from any of the documents by what is meant here by due to Harry's history?
No, I don't. And I mean, it's clear that the person writing the letter knows that something's wrong with Harry, leaving aside the fact he was there, which was wrong, but in general terms, there's something, he has a history that's bad. And the head of auxiliaries knew that, but I'm not sure how. And I'm not sure if that was informal or formal mechanism that she knew that Harry was not an appropriate person, regardless of what door he was trying to come in.
And the last sentence in that paragraph is, I've spoken with Helen and advised her that if and when she is contacted by Harry to say that the auxiliary isn't doing anything at the present time, and that if there are any problems with his persistent manner to refer him to me. Now, you've certainly accepted that this suggests that Puchel was back there in the hospital.
I do accept that.
And accessing the ward area.
At least attempting to access the ward area, yep.
And you said before, earlier in your evidence, that the documents containing the substantive allegations about Mr. Puchel weren't in fact in the hospital file.
That's correct.
So these auxiliary workers had no way to know that allegations, serious allegations of child sexual abuse had been made in relation to this Mr. Purcell.
That's correct. The auxiliaries is a vast external organisation, so what you say is true, but it applies to a vast array of people.
And there's also no record in the hospital that the reason that you indicated to him that his services were no longer required was related to an allegation of child sexual abuse.
Yeah, that's correct.
Looking back now at that approach you took, do you consider that this left the hospital vulnerable to Mr. Puchel returning to the hospital and obtaining some type of new role?
There is that potential, that clearly not in the short term, but in the long term, when people change, that is a potential, and it's not only in our hospital, but more generally in the community. Should he front up to another hospital or another organisation either that risk is there, and both those risks are worth addressing from just the Children's Hospital, sure, and that's relatively easy to have addressed that risk, but there is a larger risk as well.
Well, it's actually more than it's a potential that it could happen with Mr. Purcell. It actually happened with Mr. Purcell, didn't it? You terminated his services in January of 1998, and we know at least by July 1999 that Mr. Purcell was back engaged with the hospital.
Well, he attempted to access the ward area, which he had access to ward areas, what we know. Yes.
Well, Harry is referred to there as one of our auxiliary members. Mm-hmm. Doesn't that suggest to you he had a formal role as an auxiliary member at that point in time?
It does, but I wouldn't overplay what that meant for the patients of the hospital. That was an auxiliary member. It is a role within the organisation. It doesn't relate to patients, however.
This letter suggests that Mr. Purcell was spending time in the hospital, doesn't it?
It does. It suggests he lied about his connection with the hospital to gain access to the hospital.
The statement also said, and I'll read it out again, Robin Griffiths, the volunteer coordinator, rang me rather concerned that Harry had accessed the ward area by stating that he'd been given permission by one of the staff. Now, that sentence suggests that Harry had entered the ward area, doesn't it?
It does, and but the next four words are telling.
We understand that.
Yeah. The next four words are telling.
Yeah, we understand that he's got there, so it would seem by lying his way in.
Yes, yes.
There we are.
Yes.
But it's not there because of his role, as I understand it, as a member of the auxiliary. He's just lied his way in.
Mm-hmm.
And the next four words sort of explain that.
No. Yeah. Good. Now, at paragraph 46 of your statement, Doctor, you've addressed the issue of the policies that were in place at the time of the allegation of the abuse. Mm-hmm. And in that paragraph you say, the policy documents do not reveal any policies and procedures in place at the hospital at the time that AWI complained or previously in relation to management of complaints of past sexual abuse.
Yep. There's a whole lot there, isn't it? Complained or previously is a 20-year period.
Yeah.
And so perhaps I could just dissect that a bit.
Yes, you may.
For you. Let's go back to 1981, which is when AWI was abused. We don't have information from 1981 to say what policies and procedures were in 1981. Mm-hmm. There was, at the hospital though, it was practised and aware of child abuse because it's core business, unfortunately. So we have no written documents from 1981. I would suspect that child abuse was known about because of the hospital's core business. Is looking at one of the core business is looking after abused children. So we've got no written documentation about that other than practice at the time, if you were. Then is leaping forward in that same sentence to 1997 when AWI complained. Perhaps I've been too rushed there. There's an intervening period as well, wasn't there? Because AWI has approached the hospital over those 17-ish years by phone or by in her mum and in writing, so that I don't likewise know about the policies and procedures in that period. At the time of her complaint, there are documents available, quite thick, quite many, about sexual abuse and child abuse generally. They appear to date from about 1990 onwards, and a sort of updated version of the same thing, quite repetitive in a way, alerting staff to sexual abuse and to what to do about it should they come across it in some detail. And a lot of it links back to involve an expert. The Gatehouse Centre, if you sort of delve into documents, they come back to get help, get an expert, think about it, and act according to the guidelines with senior help. So that's a 5-sentence summary of the policies that might have been or were in place in the 90s. I couldn't speak to the 80s with any clarity.
Mm-hmm. Doctor, it's plain that for AWI, the experience was deeply traumatic, and one which should not have happened in an institution whose core business, as you say, is to care for children. You speak here of the policies that were in place at the time. The complaint was received.
Mm-hmm.
But it would be usual when you have such a significant breach of the fundamentals of an institution, such as the abuse of a child in the hospital, that the management would take steps to try and work out why the breach occurred and take steps to ensure that going forward the appropriate management regime was in place to do what it could to ensure it never happened again. Now, did you institute any investigation as to why it was able to occur?
I've got no record of doing that, and I addressed that in my last paragraph because I think that it was, on reflection, the three things I talk about in my last paragraph, address that issue as to why didn't I look for others, or a process to look for others, because that would have been, I might have done it, but I've got no recollection of doing that. Why wouldn't I have looked for others? Were there others? That might have been helpful to us and to AWI to know that there were none, for instance. And how did Harry get employed at the start? And were our employment processes adequate or not? And what vigilance was there amongst the staff to detect any opportunity for abuse? And I put them there on purpose because I think that was a failing of mine not to have done those three things. They, as you pointed out, would be quite usual to do. We'd have investigations into patients having the wrong dose of Panadol. And why, looking back, this is, at the extreme end, and why I didn't do that, I don't know, and I regret that a lot. But I wanted to make a point of that. Not everyone would have been pleased for me putting that in the submission, but I think that's, core for Law Commission to consider. It's, it's a failing of mine, and I wanted to be clear about that.
There's two issues, aren't there? One is, how does such a person become a volunteer with access to children? That's the first step. But the second step, which is probably as important, maybe more important, is what should be the management processes within the institution in relation to volunteers who do have access to children in the way that he had. And
Yep.
that does require a lot of management analysis, doesn't it, to work out?
It is quite complex. For instance, just to take an example from this very case, the psychologist spends 2 hours a week alone with a patient. It's quite normal for clinical staff to spend lots of time alone with patients. So, in steering a path forward, it's supervision is important, as it was in this case. A huge failing of poor supervision, and Harry takes advantage of AWI in an appalling way. As soon as you start to generalise that, it becomes quite complex. And no doubt you've given a lot of thought to that, but it's because there are lots of opportunities where children are alone with clinical staff, and who is the abuser? It's hard to tell, isn't it?
Well, it's apart from the Royal Commission looking at it, it's an issue that every hospital that's dealing with children
Certainly.
Needs to address for itself.
Certainly, absolutely.
What does it have, and how is it going about enforcing its management practices?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just in follow-up to those questions, Doctor, in the second incident when Harry finds himself back onto the ward again, even though he may have lied to gain access, mm-hmm. was any further information or investigation done at that time to find out who he had accessed on the ward, or whether there was any risk to children who may have been on the ward at that time?
No, I only became aware of this recently when the pack came to me. I have no memory of that happening at the time, and so I don't know what was done by those involved at the time.
Given the information that you had at the time from the previous allegation that had already been given to the hospital by AWI, it would have been in the best interest of the children in the hospital at the time when this fellow accessed those wards to at least have been able to find out whether there was any other occurrences at that time.
I have some comfort, maybe you don't, but I have some comfort that knowing the person involved, Tony Bratt, the note was sent to him. You may not know, or we may have not crossed it yet, but he was the person who drafted the termination letter. So he knew about Harry being involved the year and a half earlier. So whilst I have no knowledge at all of what happened in '99, the people involved, you'll see that the note was sent to a person involved already, and Tony Brown was involved already. So I have no doubt they did what was right. But I don't know what... I have no details.
You have no details about whether they actually went and found out where he'd been or who he had seen, or whether he'd been alone with any children at the time?
I don't have any of those details.
Mm-hmm. I have no further questions.
Yes. Mr. Ferrin, do you have any questions?
Use this just a little easier. Thank you. I've got some general questions, Doctor.
Before you start, we've adopted the practice of having counsel tell everyone, including the witness, who they are and who they appear for. You do realise there's the potential for thousands of people to be watching you at the present time.
I hope not.
Well, they could be. Anyway, just tell us.
Yes.
Tell the doctor who you are and who you represent.
My name is Ian Ferring. I'm counsel from Melbourne, and I'm here representing AWI.
Thank you.
In a minute, Doctor, I want to take you to some general questions, some of which have been raised and covered. I just want to elaborate on a couple of matters.
Mr. Ferring, you need to make sure you stay close to that microphone, so again the thousands of people can hear you.
Thank you. I just want to clarify what you said in relation to the last series of questions about Mr. Brown and what we'll call the 1999 return of Harry to the hospital. Was it correct, and if I've got this wrong, please say so, that Tony Brown, who was an executive director, was involved at the time of the termination of spoken to as Harry in 1998.
That's correct.
So he would have known all of the circumstances as were known at that time about his behaviour and the allegation.
That's correct. Sorry, that's correct.
If we go to the document that's now been taken off the screen, which is that letter, just 1 second. Yes, thank you. Yes. I assume, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that an executive director such as Mr. Brown is a very senior position within the hospital.
That's correct.
I think you said he's one of 4.
Correct.
Of the senior management team.
Correct.
If he in fact was aware fully of the circumstances of the allegations made by AWI and the suspension and then described termination of his involvement in the hospital 18 months earlier, don't you think it would have been incumbent on Mr. Brown to come to you with this further serious breach of, if you like, procedures and safe and proper care?
Yeah, that's, as I've said, I have no recollection of that happening at all.
Yes,
I would have expected it, but I have no recollection of it.
So you would have expected a fellow senior executive confronted with the facts that are set out in this memorandum to have come back to you as the CEO to say, look, we thought we'd got rid of Harry, but he's made a comeback. Mm-hmm. And he's lied to get back into the hospital. Mm-hmm. And you say you've got no recollection of that ever happening.
Yeah, I've said I've got no recollection of that happening, and I think I've said the same thing in my statement as well.
What you've added here today, and accept that you're being very assistant in providing the best answers you can, but that Mr. Brown was aware that he had participated as a senior executive officer in the matters of the complaint made by AWI only 18 months before this letter is generated.
Yeah, I believe that he drafted the letter for me to terminate Harry.
Yes. So, my question is, wouldn't you have expected such a senior person to have very deliberately made sure that you were informed of this further breach?
Well, yes is the answer to that, but I have no recollection of it happening. Maybe it did, but I've got no recollection of it happening.
Understand that, and I'm sure the searches have been very thorough. It appears that no other investigations, inquiries, memorandum, letters, or anything else by way of a paper chain was created after this event by the hospital.
We've got no paper trail that's been identified, correct?
So it would be a fair conclusion that Mr. Brown did nothing more than write this memo and took no further steps, certainly not leaving any paper trail as to inquiries or investigations that he instituted.
I think that's unreasonable.
Unreasonable?
Yep. As I've explained, Mr. Brown was a senior person in the network. He was aware of the events of January or December 97 and 98. He was at the board meeting where those issues were discussed. He's listed up. As I remember that, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think he was at the board meeting. He was a person who we relied upon a lot for human resource questions, and he more generally gave sound executive advice, experienced person. So I think it's unreasonable to say that he did nothing except sign the memo. I don't know what he did, but you asked me what do I think he did. I think he did whatever's appropriate to make sure that Harry never set foot in the building again.
Well, are you able to assist the Commission and indicate what steps were taken by Mr Brown or anyone else to ensure that Harry didn't lie his way back in 6 or 12 months later again?
No, I have no documentation around that.
This goes to one of the general questions, but I'll put it in this context. How would the staff at this hospital, which would number thousands, am I correct about that?
Correct.
It's a very large public hospital.
It is.
How would other staff, even senior staff within the hospital, know that when Harry appears 6 or 12 months later and might lie to them, that he is someone who should not be allowed into a ward, should not be allowed into this hospital?
Let me be general to start with and be specific. Any member of the public could lie their way into the hospital. So let's understand that. We have safeguards to prevent that, as happened here, but the hospital is on purpose open so that parents, friends, relations can visit children, so that there's a lot of coming and going in a hospital, and that's good, particularly in a children's hospital. So then you've asked me, quite rightly, how would one identify Harry, of all the people coming to a hospital, as being an inappropriate person? That is very difficult, because there will be tens of thousands of visitors any year to the hospital, and to identify one is, to all staff, the thousands you've mentioned, is a difficult task. A very difficult task, even knowing one wanted to do that. It is very difficult to single out one person from the Victorian population that we don't want and make that known to all the staff. Desirable, but it would be difficult, I think.
If you set your standards that high, it would be very difficult, I accept that. But within this hospital, there will be staff members who are very long-standing, who would be on wards such as the respiratory ward or other wards with many years of experience, and would know their patients and would know who is coming and going within that small part of the hospital, not the whole hospital. It's a huge institution.
That's true.
Yeah. So we don't have thousands of staff just wandering around. We would have people in some wards who would have 20, 30 years of experience and commitment, so that they would know who was expected to come into their ward, doctors, other staff and volunteers.
Yes, the volunteers are identified with, badges and whatnot, so that you're either a volunteer or you're not.
Yes. But they would know who they would be expecting to come
absolutely.
in, because you just don't turn up, I'm a volunteer and I'll go into Ward 6 and have a little chat with people.
No, there's a roster, and there's a roster of volunteers, and then there's an identification of volunteers, and then there's a reporting mechanism for volunteers, go to the chief nurse, etc.
Yeah.
So there's a random person is fairly well prevented from entering a ward under the volunteer banner, as it were.
So charge nurses and experienced nurses on wards would know that Mr Jones or Mr Smith is likely to be in here on Wednesday and Thursday, or whatever it might be.
Correct. Not
just strangers would turn up and they'd say, oh, he's a volunteer, that's okay.
No, it's correct.
Yes. So my question goes to, if you like, those sorts of staff, as to how they would know, or how they were to be informed, that Harry, not one out of the 5 million people who live in Victoria, but how Harry, someone who has been excluded, is not to be allowed back into a ward.
Okay, well, he hasn't got the volunteer credentials. He's not on the volunteer roster, and he's not known to the nursing chief in the ward that he's a volunteer coming today. So that the checks in the chain are, back a bit, in that the volunteers are, as I said, you have to become a volunteer, then you have to be rostered to a particular place, and you have to report to a particular person when you volunteer to that place. So you can't roll up and say, I'm a volunteer, because that's not possible.
No.
for good reason, obviously.
Okay.
Doctor, what you're saying is that there are inherent in the volunteer regime
Yes.
checks on who comes in as a volunteer.
Not only that, it's sort of getting through the door, obviously failed, but become a volunteer, and then subsequent to becoming a volunteer as to where you go, how you sign in, all that sort of
But what you're saying is it's a much more difficult task to identify a visitor who may be someone you don't want in the hospital.
Impossible, probably, and that's clearly a balance between visitors, family, relations, friends, visiting sick children, and someone else trying to observe sick children. In the generality of it all, patients and wards are busy places with lots of people around all the time, as distinct from what has happened to AWI in an isolated spot that an abuser has found to abuse her.
Well, again, it becomes a question of the management regime within the ward,
Yep.
doesn't it?
It does, and it is clearly a failing here, if we were to pick one out of the many, that AWI was allowed to be by herself in a secluded spot with an abuser.
That's true. An abuser who's there with the permission of the hospital.
Correct.
But when it's a casual visitor, I've only been in a limited number of hospitals, but one could experience, and have experience in an adult hospital anyway, effectively gaining access to the person you want to see without any supervision or control at all.
That's correct, and that's quite the reasonable thing, that visitors should visit whom they want to at most times, day or night, and to given the number of visitors, number of patients, that seems to be quite the reasonable thing.
But what about children's hospitals?
Well, it goes to supervision, I think. That's the management issue is the supervision issue. Yeah. Now, in ward, it depends, and a design issue too. You might say it's a problem for architects, not for us. But our children's hospital, designed so that there is the opportunity for supervision in the ward area that AWI has described. It's totally glass between the various cubicles and sections. 6 to 8 beds, 6 beds, I think, from memory, per section. That's all glass, and the nursing stations are glassed. So there's a whole lot of visual supervision day and night, except for 3 isolation rooms on one side, which would be the south side, where more sick children were cared for. And then there was the playroom, which was down one end. But architecturally, the design was such that there was supervision, even if your parent or your friends weren't there. There were multiple others around at the time. So it was quite a sound design from that point of view, because there was glass everywhere. In a different setting, I remember a headmaster who had glass wall for his study or his office for this very reason, he explained to me, because he would see children and he wanted it to be clear at all times that he was talking with children and nothing else. And, it was a design issue that he particularly instigated for that purpose.
This question's already been asked of you, but I just want to clarify what your answer was. You indicated this morning that there was a list, at least, of volunteers which might have gone back 20 or 25 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And where was that kept in the hospital at the time of the complaint?
I believe it would have been, I don't have no particular knowledge, but I believe because of the type of list it would have been held in the volunteers area. As I said this morning, the volunteers were meticulous in recording how many years they had worked at the hospital, and that was celebrated yearly, and a yearly occasion I would give medals and awards for those that had been long serving, so that there were meticulous records for that purpose only, or at least that purpose, as to who had been a volunteer and how many years they'd been a volunteer. But I don't believe it would have been kept in the human resources area, but I've got no particular knowledge of that.
So, again, if this is my misunderstanding, please say so, but that would appear to mean that that list was not, if you like, readily available or accessible to nursing staff or other hospital staff within the hospital. It had a particular purpose and was kept in the volunteers area.
Yes, the nursing, it had it had multiple purposes, no doubt, but I know that it would have been kept, is what the example I gave you is why it would have been kept at least for one purpose. The nursing staff had no need to know of all the volunteers, because there were perhaps hundreds all over the hospital, and they would tend to go to the same place even for 25 years. The same volunteer would come every Monday for 25 years, so to the same spot. So that the nursing staff would typically have the same volunteer, and that would be known, and it would be rostered, and they'd come with their credentials, bits of paper, whatever.
I understand, Doctor, my question is really aimed at something else. But that the list would not have been readily available to nursing staff, and probably most nursing staff would not have known that the list either existed or where it was. When I say nursing staff, I mean professional staff. Sure. It might be psychologists or others, but in the group.
Yes, is the answer. To the particular question, the answer is clearly yes.
They would have known, or they wouldn't?
No, they wouldn't have known where the list was. What I was trying to say was they wouldn't need to know where it was, that's all.
Yeah. The question then is if a staff member, nurse, psychologist, whatever, had a concern when they observed a volunteer who had the badge coming and going within the hospital, other than come to you or go to senior staff, was there any way they could check that that person was permitted to enter the hospital and be seen within or active within wards at all?
Sure. They would talk to the head of volunteers who rostered them there every week.
Right. So there'd be no documentation that they would say, I'll go and check the list whether Mr. Smith is a volunteer and should be here on Thursday.
They'd bring up the head of volunteers if they thought there was something amiss.
Yes.
And they would bring the head of volunteers. As I said, the volunteering was very regular and to particular areas, so that something out of the ordinary would be quite obvious, and any changes would be usually discussed, because in the documents there's a whole thing about matching volunteers to areas, matching their interests, etc. And so if person A had come for 20 years, then person B come, that would have been discussed beforehand, and if person B turned up, then they'd know who to ring. But person B is not person A.
I understand the significance and importance of volunteers. My questions are aimed more at the question of where you have someone, or you are dealing with the issue of someone who comes not with the best of intentions, how you deal with that rogue element, if you want to call them that. Not the 99% or whatever it is, of people who do years and years of dedicated service. That's not the problem.
No, it's the rogue is the problem, as you rightly say. The failings are many. The employment of a rogue is number one. We've just discussed, and it's interesting to note that he would have passed a police check. So for noting.
Well, he did.
He did pass a police check. Yeah. So that's of note for us all. Then there's the supervision of him by experienced people, as you say. Perhaps not alert to the possibility as they should have been, because it wasn't recognised that this was happening. They are the two steps really that where we failed. We've employed him, and we haven't noticed that it wasn't right.
Now, can I just clarify a couple? I mean, this is a more general question now. Thank you, Doctor. As to the volunteer program, this is in the time that you were, first of all, CEO. Were there, if you like, individual files that you could go, you or anyone else who was senior management, could go and check Mr. Smith's file, Mr. Jones's file, or whatever, to see, for example, yes, there has been a police check, yes, there's been no complaints, yes, they turn up on Mondays and Tuesdays whenever they're supposed to, but is there, or was there, a file which would indicate what each volunteer's role and information was?
Yep, I've got no particular knowledge of that. I can draw from the myriad of documents that, or at least from the volunteer guidelines document, that data like that was collected, but I'm not sure if it was kept in some useful way or not. It was to be noted, that they didn't turn up, then they didn't turn up for 3 weeks, then they were put off the list, etc. So, by implication, that sort of data was collected about attendance and other activities, where they were working, why they were working, did they like it. So there was some data collection going on, perhaps quite detailed, about volunteers, but where that was kept, I don't know.
In terms of the management of children's hospitals, such as this one, given what you now know, do you think it would be an appropriate and perhaps a step forward that there be either, first of all, a register of volunteers, and secondly, the keeping of a file with respect to any registrar with all of that sort of information recorded on the file?
I think record keeping is valuable, not only for children's hospitals, but we're talking about children in general. For that information to be, particularly adverse information, to be shareable. And I don't even know if, for instance, for a case that was mandatorily reported, is that report of that person, available when you do a police check or not? There's a lot of different things happen. There are police checks, there are police reports, there's mandatory reporting. But are these all silos where no one actually knows what's happened? If I do a mandatory report over here about a person or implicating a person, is the loop ever closed? And I don't know the answer to that. But so that's to answer your question. Is it good to have a register of people generally who may have failed or thought to have failed? The answer is yes, and you'll perhaps point you to this is not a new thought. In one of the documents, you remember my marginal note 2 says, is he on the B list, or words to that effect?
Yes.
Well, that's, even at that time, what's 97, there was discussion about, well, this person's not a convicted abuser, but he should be listed somewhere as a person who might be, or we're suspicious about, or worried about. And that informal thing, I believe, was in place with the Victorian Police. I think it's very useful. It's it might be an infringement of people's rights on the one hand, or on the other hand, it alerts institutions such as mine that they need to be careful with person A. Speaking generally.
Yeah, thank you for that. I was really splitting it into two, and it's my fault for the question, but there was one, if you like, a file or a register within the hospital in relation to
in the hospital, certainly.
And secondly, then, which was where I was going to ask you, but you've already gone to it in one sense, whether or not the question of the broader dissemination of those concerns or information is something that we might take from this investigation, because Harry could have gone down the road in February or March to the Royal Melbourne Hospital, which still has quite a few children in it, which is all of about 200 metres from your hospital, yes, and said, well, I was or had been a volunteer, but I'm free on Fridays, and they might well have taken him at face value, and because there was no, if you like, link or communication, to your hospital.
That's true,
and that's
and
dangerous.
here's my police check with me. It's true that there's internal lists are important, but with people like this, as we can see, they're relentless, and the system needs to be relentless as well.
Thank you in relation to that. Can I go back? Can I just, as to your involvement with the hospital, I think I understood correctly that you became the CEO in 1995.
No, it's deputy, I think, there's actually a couple of hospitals. I was the deputy of both and then the CEO of both. About 97, I believe, I became the chief executive.
So I think it was said that might have been in July.
Correct.
Of 97, you became the CEO in a single office, if that's correct, for the children's.
No.
Both hospitals
yes,
at that stage.
I'd only ever been the CEO of both hospitals.
Both hospitals.
Yeah,
Thank you.
They were a single entity,
yes.
and I was responsible for both.
Right. So you became the CEO of the two hospitals, that has been the Children's and the Royal Women's, in July, in a formal sense, of 1997.
Correct.
But you, I think, now I understand it, you had been deputy for perhaps 2 years or 18 months.
So, again, of both hospitals, yes.
Yes, right. Now, either when you were deputy, but more importantly when you were the CEO, did you give any consideration to, given that you were the new broom on the block, so to speak, any consideration to reviewing the policies and procedures that related to volunteers?
Well, you can see that I apparently did. In the two documents with the volunteer guidelines, one is signed by my predecessor, which would have been sometime in the 90s, early 90s. He commenced work 1990 and ran to 97. And there's a volunteers guidelines, the introductory page signed by him. In 98, which is the year after these events, I see that I have signed the next version of the volunteer guidelines. I have compared them to see...
That's my next question.
Yeah.
Dr. So could
you right.
what we learned?
I didn't learn much, you might say. If you compare the guidelines, you'll see there's, I think, only 3 or 4 words. There's a list of what are your responsibilities, what must you not do type stuff. The area where we drew the termination reasons from. And there's very little difference in the guidelines at all. They were sound and they covered all bases, at least, but they are not specific to every duty, but they are set the scene for what is expected of a volunteer and the boundaries you cannot cross, and the gift giving, the cards, the becoming close, the involvement are all prohibited things for volunteers to do. There's no difference, and the sign-on, sign-off, the interview beforehand, you must be seen before you get hired. You can't just write a letter and get hired. All that stuff is documented. But to my reading, it didn't change much between those two. And I've, to answer your next question, the issue of recording transgressions is not addressed in those guidelines that I can see.
Did it cross your mind, I appreciate this is a long time ago, but did it cross your mind that perhaps that should be made clear to volunteers as well, perhaps to members of the public, but to the volunteers, if you like, that there would be follow-up and there would be consequences?
Sure, and it's to be, the answer is yes, unequivocally. To be observed, though, how relentless a person who is stood down and terminated a year later is relentless or bold or enough to turn up at the front door and try and talk his way in. It's the the barriers need to be quite high to stop people like this.
Accept that, Doctor, and that leads to my next question, Your hospital, that is the Royal Children's, had the Gatehouse Clinic, which is has been there for a long time and has specialists and high degrees of experience in relation to child sexual abuse as well as physical abuse. Mm-hmm. Unlike perhaps some other hospitals who don't quite have that level of expertise, this hospital had access to one of the premier facilities in Melbourne.
That's correct.
To give advice and to assist in ensuring that the children in its care in the hospital, not ones who have been brought in because they've been abused, but in the hospital, were given utmost protection. Do you remember at any time, if you like, seeking assistance and or asking for opinions or guidance from the Gatehouse Clinic as to what might improve the security, to use that expression, within the hospital in relation to rogue volunteers or staff for that matter, but in this particular case rogue volunteers, to try and improve as best, accepting the problems that you've identified?
No, I don't recall getting that extra advice or instituting any programs to generate ideas or to search for other children that might have been abused, although I have sought subsequently that information and I understand there were none, and AWI should at least know that.
Can I take you, Doctor, to now some more specific questions? I'm sorry to jump around. The letter of termination, which I think is document 0021.
I can remember most of it if that's helpful.
There we go. Would you just roll it up slightly, please? Thank you. In the second paragraph, it says, I understand you've been spoken to in the past about boundaries to be observed by volunteers following breaches of the same by yourself. Where did that information come from?
Now, this letter is being written by me. It's been drafted by Human Resources. The source of this of that sentence and the sentence, the whole of the second paragraph, if you like, most likely would have come from volunteer chief, because he's been spoken to in the past. So the people authorised to speak to him would be the chief of volunteers or the unit manager in the area. They would be typically, that would be the chiefs or the line managers.
Again, and this is really asking you to comment, looking back now at that letter, wouldn't it have been better if you, in this situation where you are considering terminating a volunteer, to have had access to the full details of the boundaries that have been broken, or the breaches, or the giving of a gift to a patient, and the other matters are obliquely referred to?
Yeah. Perhaps I was given that, but I didn't. Perhaps someone told me that. I don't remember. I don't even remember signing the letter, but obviously I did. And with enthusiasm, I would expect. But I don't remember those details, if they were given to me or not.
Thank you. Could we go to document 007, which is the AWI's initial communication to you, please? if I misheard you, please say so, Doctor, but I thought you said this morning that with respect to the question of making telephone contact with AWI, that you didn't appreciate that her phone number was on this communication. Is that correct?
It is correct, yes.
Are you sure about that?
I am sure. I first became aware that the numbers under
If I could just object at this point, as I understand the evidence, it was in relation to the very first email that evidence was given. Certainly this can be followed as a course of cross-examination with respect to this letter, but the answer was given in respect of the very first email.
That's correct.
I think this is the first email, isn't it?
If you scroll down to the bottom, I can tell that the first email was dated the 15th, and in the second page, so redacted is where the phone number turns out to be, down the very bottom, and I didn't recognise that as a phone number in the unredacted versions. There are numbers which are not recognisable. In that there's a Japanese country code, which I didn't recognise. There was no plus in front of it to indicate that it was an international number. And to be absolutely frank, it wasn't until I read AWI's note that I looked at the bottom and recognised that what she was talking about. To this day, to that day, I didn't know. I must have read it 20 times, and I didn't recognise the number on any of those occasions. If you just scroll down to the second last paragraph, you'll see that AWI says, please contact me via email to let me know your thoughts. That's what she said. So that's in fact what I did, and she replied to the email.
I understand that, but if you go to the bottom of that page, the last sentence, having
Yep, I can read.
You my contact phone number, and if you choose to call, I will be happy to inform you. The very document says that she's giving you her phone number. Are you saying to this commission that you didn't draw a connection between that statement and the number that then followed under her signature?
I absolutely, and with no equivocation, say that I never, ever recognised those numbers as being the phone number she refers to at any time in the past 17 years, ever.
Okay.
And the Commission might like to look at the numbers in an unredacted copy to see that they are generally meaningless to a person who's not looking for a number.
Well, just to clarify this, you knew she was in Japan, didn't you?
I did. I absolutely knew that. I don't know the Japan country code, though.
No. But you know, this is a question, that when you make international phone calls, there will be a country code.
I am aware of that.
Yes. And you often will find the numbers that take you out of Australia, certainly at this time. And then you have the international country code, and then you have,
Yeah, sure.
they have area codes and then the phone number.
If there'd been 0011 or if there'd been a plus, whatever the Japanese, I would have recognised it, but I absolutely and categorically did not recognise that as a phone number for AWI, and I responded, as I said, because she asked me to respond by email.
Yeah.
Of course, it's regrettable that I didn't call her. It would have been fabulous if I had called her, particularly since she didn't get my emails.
I understand that, Doctor. I was just clarifying your answer, that's all. Thank you, Doctor. Can we go to document 0011, please? This is the letter to Mr. Snowden. It says, as it's quite clearly
just
as brief as language you're going to find, I attach additional correspondence from AWI. The situation appears satisfactory. Just explain to the Commission what it was that you thought on the 11th of February, or what the factors were on the 11th of February for you making that proposition to Mr. Snowden that the situation was satisfactory.
Sure. It's the reason I've said the situation appears satisfactory is contained in the additional correspondence from AWI. So I don't have that correspondence. No one has that correspondence. AWI doesn't have that correspondence, it would appear. But the correspondence has made me add that sentence. The situation appears satisfactory. And as we discussed this morning, it's on or about the same date that the Victorian Police are given that similar words are expressed to the Victorian Police. I don't know what's in the email though.
They got that piece of information from either you or someone at the hospital.
Correct.
So the hospital told the police that things were satisfactory.
Correct. And
they didn't get it independently.
Well, the police were asked for, and it says, were provided with written confirmation of that. That doesn't seem to be available from the police, but the police say that written confirmation will be provided, I think is what they said in their Victorian Police report.
It was provided, but that's from the hospital.
Correct, but all the information was, the police asked quite rightly for written confirmation of an important statement like that, and we had offered to provide the police with that important information in writing, and that is, so that satisfactory I believe refers to the additional, whatever was in the additional correspondence.
Can I suggest to you that the loop went slightly different to you? Perhaps you're not disagreeing with me, perhaps you are, that you communicated, or your office communicated, that things were satisfactory, and you confirmed that in writing, and then the police recorded that as a fact, but the fact came from you and not from AWI. She never spoke to the police nor written to them at that stage.
No, I didn't say that she'd done that.
So it came from the hospital?
The police report said it did come from the hospital.
Yes. I'm just making sure to clear that.
No, yeah, the police report says hospital has advised, or
yes.
Redacted has advised, and Redacted has been asked to provide written confirmation, or was offered to provide written confirmation.
Yes.
Correct.
So the loop is the police and the hospital, no one else is coming to this situation that everything is satisfactory.
No, just take you back to the document we're looking at. The document we're looking at says, I attach additional correspondence from AWI. Sure. That is the link to AWI that's important, otherwise it's made up.
Well, it may not be made up, and I want to go to the next step in the chain. I just wanted to complete that there was no doubt in your mind that the question of satisfaction was generated by the hospital to the police and then confirmed to the police that everything was satisfactory.
No, I didn't say
nothing.
That. No, the satisfaction comes from AWI, according to this letter. AWI has said something.
Yeah.
My conclusion has been situation appears satisfactory, and that has been reported for the police. The police have had no contact with AWI, but we have offered to provide the police with evidence or written confirmation that the situation is satisfactory. And the documentation around that is this letter.
And you say that there was, in this letter, and you've said in your evidence, that there was additional correspondence. Is that correct?
That's right.
When you say additional, what is it additional to?
To the information that has already been sent to John Snowden, which are the emails that we have already, the 4 from me and the 2 from her, a total of 6. total of 6 pieces of correspondence were the original set of correspondence, and here I'm attaching additional to those 6.
What enables you to say that what was the correspondence that had initially been sent to John Snowden, what that entailed?
Because the police obtained that correspondence from Phillips Fox in 2002, and so that is the copy, I understand, that the Commission is dealing with. So that's the original 6 pieces of correspondence that were sent to John Snowden on about 21 January. And so now...
22nd.
22nd,
yep.
And now a certain number of days have elapsed. I can't see the date. And something else has appeared. And so I've sent that to 2 people, one to John Snowden on the 11th of February, and you'll see at the bottom I've also sent that to Dr. McIntyre.
Yeah. Can we call that document 0029, please? This is the first letter from yourself to Mr. Snowden, attaching for your files confidential correspondence from AWI regarding her care, etc. That's dated the 22nd of January 98.
Yep.
Right. From that, you don't know what the confidential correspondence was. Doesn't appear to be identified.
The correspondence which attached was sent to the police by Phillips Fox when AWI came back to Victoria. That package was sent to the police, and I think they are the documents that the Commission, that's the origin of these documents.
I don't think it's quite as simple as that. It is said that the police had some emails. It's not clear that they had which emails. You've just assumed, haven't you, Doctor, that the first 2 emails that we now know, and we've looked at it, were sent to Mr. Snowden, and then after this date, you've assumed another email came in which you sent on the 11th of February, but that may not be correct.
Well, I know that I wrote my last email that we have a copy of on the 19th of January. Then we've had a board meeting, and I've sent, well, in fact...
Not your emails, Doctor, it's the
Yep.
AWI's emails I'm concerned about in these questions.
Yes, you'll see fortuitously or whatever, the emails are all intertwined because of the way the email system worked, so that you have to look at the last page to find my first email because they're all intertwined. So it's sort of not possible to extract out some and not the others. They all came in a pack. So I firmly believe that I have sent John Snowden, and that's the pack we're dealing with, all the correspondence I had up until this date, and the last date on the correspondence is the 19th of January. But for some reason, about 3 weeks later, I've written again saying there's something else. I think I would have remembered if I'd sent it already and that I was sending something new. I can't tell you any more than's in the documents that say here is additional correspondence.
Because that's because you draw the conclusion because of the word additional correspondence that it was new and not in fact either the second email which you hadn't sent on the first occasion or you simply duplicated.
No, the first and all my emails and all her emails are intertwined. You can't separate them out because they're a trail of things just continuing on top of each other. So I can't, I mean, a forensic person would no doubt look at it, but they can't be torn apart and set separately. They came as a scrolled package of emails, and that's why they're so difficult to untwist. But I believe when I wrote that letter, I was attaching something else. And you see that down the bottom of it, it says attachment, so that the sort of thing that support staff would do would, write down attachment.
On another matter, Doctor, when you went on your holidays, justly deserved, I'm sure, for January or in January of 1998,
Yes.
Presumably there would have been a handover or some discussion with the deputy or the acting CEO as to what may or may not happen in the few weeks that you were going to be on your holidays.
Yep, correct.
Did you, in fact, let Alan Studley know that he might have contact made by AWI during the January period about a matter of substance and, in effect, sexual abuse in the hospital?
Yep.
You did?
I don't remember doing it, but the documents would indicate that I did.
How do they indicate that?
In the document, and I don't know the number, I'm sorry, it's the one where I've got handwritten notes on it on the side. 1, 2, 3 handwritten notes. It's probably the file I had on my desk. By the looks of it, I wrote some things on the side. But I think in the top right-hand corner...
I wonder if the witness, in fairness, could be shown RMH.000.010.010.0010.
Say that again quickly.
Perhaps we just find the document a little bit...
We'll perhaps wait for the document.
I think it's 10, isn't it?
It's tab 430.
So, as I said, to answer your...
Coming, Doctor.
Oh, sorry.
It'll be here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for finding that. So this appears to be my working file in that I've written on it down the side there. That's not relevant right now. So you've asked me, would it be normal? The answer is yes, it would be normal. Do I have any memory of that? The answer is no, I don't. But I note in the top right-hand corner there's a squiggle, which I believe is Alan Studley's squiggle, dated 6/1/98. And I think, to me, that means that he had the working file and he was contacted on that date and has, made some squiggle on the side that he was sawn the patient on that date. It's not my writing, and I believe that squiggle is the one that he used when in documents that I would have seen many from him. So you asked me, was there a handover? I believe yes, because he had that document, and perhaps that's the day that AWI contacted the hospital.
Thank you.
As it turned out, an unsatisfactory experience, but
If a contact had been made more, either in person or perhaps the emails continued to flow more freely, whatever, what do you believe today would have been the support, and I'm talking about professional support, would have been offered to AWI if she'd come into your office on the 5th, whatever, 20th of January and had contact with you?
okay. That's a timely question. My thinking, I believe, and on reflection, if you like, is that, as you know, I flagged with AWI that I wanted to involve the head of the Gatehouse Centre in the discussion because she has a vast professional experience in dealing with abused, and my background is radiology, quite the other end of the spectrum, quite a black and white specialty. And so I would have discussed with AWI what her needs were, but also be guided by the head of Gatehouse Centre as to what was appropriate, even if it wasn't recognised by AWI, as what might be appropriate for her. So I think in the answer to your question, it's
Sorry, Doctor,
that's all right.
I'm a little distracted.
No, it's all right. I know the feeling. The type of counselling support that was appropriate for AWI comes from a discussion with AWI or with professionals. I might offer something which might have been, people do, chief executives do, they do their best. But I think in this setting where I knew that it was a specialist area, it was important to have someone to assist me in determining AWI's state and what would be the best first step for her. And hence that the meeting was flagged to be with two people, although she had a preference for meeting with me particularly, which was good. I think it was important to explain to her that I would have someone who knew about her pain and her suffering and understand what might be helpful to her at the same meeting. That's what I would have done if I had the chance to meet her, which I may yet do, but I haven't yet met her.
So would a fair summary of that, Doctor, would be that you probably would have passed her on to the Gatehouse Clinic if she'd expressed an interest in having psychological support?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they would have had adult expertise, that they were certainly experts with children and adolescents in all their forms and variations, but given AWI's was now an adult, then there may be others that were better placed and experienced to deal with that, but certainly I would have asked Gatehouse's assistance in identifying the proper pathway for AWI, and particularly more complex because she actually wasn't living in Australia and it needed to be handled at a distance, again with someone who was appropriate for her, not random.
Given that was the direction that you were envisaging where this might have gone with respect to that aspect of the complaint, did you subsequently put in place any mechanisms or policies or procedures to deal with any future difficulties or complaints with respect to providing that sort of support? Did you see it as important that the hospital be able to respond quickly and effectively if another complaint came in from another person in those circumstances?
Yes, it's important that one do that. I unfortunately have a background in radiology where this is not an uncommon issue for radiologists to deal with, the aspects of traumatic child abuse. So I was aware that the hospital generally was relatively good at looking after people. And, a policy is for the general, so you cope with everything. And I think there was a policy to deal with child abuse in that there was a staff were aware of the importance of recognising and caring and involving specialists. I know things are much more sophisticated now, and that's excellent. That the sex abuse or child sexual abuse is split into those coming from outside and those occurring internally. Fortunately, the internal ones are very small in number, but given our experience here, that I understand is now in place, and you'll no doubt explore that later today.
Now, when you did communicate with Phillips Fox, and I'm sorry for jumping around, but I got distracted from this issue. When you did communicate with Phillips Fox and did send off the material to Mr. Snowden, could you explain what it was that you were seeking to achieve by, like, and I'm not wishing to criticise you, by like of moving out of the immediate control of the hospital to your solicitors documents which contained fairly serious allegations, to say the least?
My purpose, frankly, was to meet AWI's concerns and wishes. That we've only got two letters from two emails from AWI, so I'm making some judgment about her general state, not having had any other communication with her until the current communications. But if we can take ourselves back to when I had two letters to deal with only, one of her concerns was publicity, parents, others knowing, quite understandably and reasonably, and that she would be concerned about those things, and she'd had poor experiences with the hospital to date. So I didn't want to cause her any grief or harm by not protecting her confidentiality as long as she wanted it. Now, I had transgressed there without seeking her permission. I'd reported it to police because I thought that that needed to be done, whatever she thought. So I didn't ask her about that. I did it, and she may be disappointed about that, but so be it. With regard to the documents, it's my medical background that if you haven't got the documents, you're guilty, and I'm careful to the documents be preserved, and I'm careful that that AWI's confidentiality was respected. That's why I did it, and it turns out I was right, I think. I don't ask for you to answer that. I'm not asking questions.
I understand, Doctor, you put a note on her medical record saying there is confidential information.
I did.
So that if someone just went to the medical records, they might say, oh, there's a letter here or a memo saying there's more information, I need to go looking for it. I understand that's being protected because those records would be accessible by many people in many circumstances. You don't need to know about these allegations. That seems to be fairly straightforward. It's the step of then moving them out of your office, to use that in the, not the physical sense, but in terms of your office, to your solicitors at that stage, and saying these are confidential and we ask you to hold them, but I might do that as a backup, but it would appear that if you like, the original, all the documents were shipped out and you did not have them available within the hospital.
Well, they were a number of answers, really. That they, of course, were available on my emails, but they've subsequently all been destroyed, is my understanding. They're not available on the email, although they, for a certain amount of time, they were available on the servers for me to access anyway. Perhaps as I said this morning, I've used this technique once in the past where a particular diagnosis wanted to be protected from a patient, to put the file off-site so that it was available to meet the needs of a particular parent. I'd taken that course to protect the diagnosis from being generally known, and so it's not. I hadn't only used it with AWI. I had used it previously in a different setting, but with the same purpose, so that the information wasn't generally available. And I guess that most of my other correspondence is actually lost now, so filing it in my office, as it were, would not have served us well today.
My next question is, given that you were providing fairly important documents, and I think you accept this, to your solicitors for safekeeping, was there any arrangement, agreement, understanding or anything else with the solicitors about what they would do with them and how long they would keep them?
No, I didn't anticipate the length of time at all. I thought they'd keep them forever, but in fact they kept them for long enough, but how much longer they would have kept them, I don't know.
Well, it's a little difficult to know how long they kept them, what they did with them, and when they were lost.
I don't think they were lost, because I think that they were returned. You've seen further documents this afternoon that they were returned, I think, by subsequent executives, or at the behest of subsequent executives, to the police, and shown to AWI.
Some things might have been, but not necessarily everything, because we're not too sure what was sent, and they're not too sure what they had. They had some emails, but it's rather unsatisfactory, isn't it? You've seen the letters from the solicitors, haven't you?
I've seen the to and fro's asking for the documents from Phillips Fox, and my understanding is these are the ones that have been provided by Phillips Fox.
Yeah.
Now, I have asked particularly that the Phillips Fox documents be provided, rather than any hospital copies, rather than hospital support documents, because they may not have attachments, but I was particular to ask that the documents from Phillips Fox be all provided and checked on, because they are my set, the ones I sent.
Yep. Perhaps we could have a look at 0009, the document. This is the last of the communications. This is a letter
I
from
don't know that I've seen this document.
This is a letter from Natalie Franks of Phillips Fox, dated the 18th of June 2002, and it's to the General Manager of the Royal Children's Hospital. Makes reference to earlier letters in which it was said they couldn't find anything, and then say, further searches, I have located the email correspondence between Dr. John DeCampo and AWI in relation to the above matter. In the light of this, pass them on to the police. That's because requests have been made.
So there appears to be, there appears to be two copies here. One has gone to the police, and I enclose a copy for your records.
Yes. But these are the documents being, in that sense, brought back into the hospital from your solicitors, which you did not otherwise have in the hospital.
That's correct.
Right. And that situation arose because you, and that's just an observation, decided, because of their confidential nature, that copies should not be retained within the hospital and should be retained by the hospital solicitor.
I did.
My question is, why did you feel the need to do that when you could have kept them confidential, not on the medical records, safe in your office in some appropriate file? Because this was a very serious matter, and surely, Doctor, you couldn't have thought that there mightn't have been repercussions down the track.
Well, I wasn't sort of looking at. I wasn't looking for repercussions. I was looking to look after AWI, and that was my focus, and that's why I sent them for safekeeping and to protect her confidentiality, because at that time, it's my judgment that was really important to her. Subsequently, it's not, and we're the beneficiaries of that, in fact, today. But at that time, that was something that I thought was important to her, and I would look after her in what small way I could by doing that. it turns out it serves another purpose in that the documents are available, but that's only a byproduct.
But shouldn't those sort of documents be available from the hospital for a very, very long time? These shouldn't just be thrown out at the end of 5 or 6 years because someone has come and complained again, surely.
Sure. And that was my expectation.
But did you ask the solicitor
No,
to make sure these are not
check
lost, destroyed or otherwise?
I didn't check with the solicitors how long they might be keeping the documents for, and I suspect they keep them longer than hospitals keep their records.
And back to my first question. Surely, Doctor, it wasn't just the question of looking after AWI's concerns. Surely you must have had concerns about the issue of such a complaint, whether the police might come next week, next month, next year, or other consequences might arise from this type of allegation down the track from when you were dealing with them.
So I preserved the documents so that they will be available for anyone who might be interested in them legitimately to be available for them, and made it clear to the board, made it clear to the medical records that there were documents, and you'll see in the file note, on one of the file notes, the one in the medical record, it says,
Yes.
you know, someone's called for the documents, we'll get them. That's the the system working. That the document was there. They knew who to ring. They rang and they found.
It wasn't quite that simple, was it?
It wasn't. No, it was 5 or 50 emails later, but they were found.
Well, some documents were found. We don't know whether that was the entire file.
Yes, and as we've pointed out, there's apparently one to and one from email that we haven't got.
Yeah. One last question, Doctor, and if you don't feel that this is an area of your expertise, please say so, but in situations such as this where there has been a complaint or an allegation of sexual abuse, do you not think the hospital has some responsibility and some role to play in ensuring that the broader people who may be affected, such as family members, are also taken into account and perhaps provided with support?
Absolutely. I don't think I need any expertise to answer that question. It's
Probably not.
Absolutely is my answer.
What steps were taken by you or the hospital at the time of this complaint to assist not just AWI, but her family and people, as you've heard today, and I would have thought, Doctor, it's not hard to understand that these sort of matters are very traumatic and very fracturing for people's lives. And sometimes they don't immediately make the best judgment calls about what they should do. This is the Royal Children's Hospital. It's got expertise. Don't you think that the hospital should have been concerned about ensuring that family members, particularly mother and father, were also supported and understood what had happened and the damage that had been done?
Sure, it would have been generally appropriate to, via AWI, to assist her and her family in the conversations, shall we put it, that I had with AWI. That wasn't appropriate at that time because she had asked particularly once or twice, at least perhaps twice, that her parents not even know that she was worried, concerned, or had contacted me. So without her permission, I wouldn't have done that.
But I'm not suggesting you'd override
it. But it's something that's quite appropriate. As I've said, it's absolutely appropriate, with her permission.
Yes.
And encouragement.
But that sometimes requires professionals and others
It does. And
make the offer,
absolutely.
make it again, and ensure that perhaps it's thought about rather than just dismissed, because initially it's a very challenging thing for people to have to do, to say to their families, this happened to me and I feel I've been let down, and a lot worse?
Well, and a lot worse.
Yes.
And the answer is yes, that's absolutely appropriate. And when we had our conversations, other than asking her to personally seek professional advice, I didn't get the opportunity to provide advice to her or her family.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.
I have no further questions.
Ms. Judd?
Just a couple of issues, Your Honour. I wonder if, perhaps if I could start by saying, Kerry Judd for the State of Victoria. I wonder if I could have brought up on the screen RMH.0001.010.0013. Dr. De Campo, you have in front of you a couple of emails. It's the second email starting Dear Dr. De Campo that I want you to focus on. Dr. Bennett took you to a couple of, or quite a number of parts of this email, and I just want to take you to another couple of parts. If you could look down at the second paragraph starting, I will tell you my name, and I want you to focus on the third line starting, I imagine. And it reads, I imagine the hospital and yourself are just as opposed to having this made public as I am. Your confirmation of my assumption would be appreciated. And I also want to draw, at the same time, draw your attention to the fourth paragraph, which starts, I would. We could just scroll down a bit further. Thank you. I would like to ask that you do not contact my parents. They would die if they suddenly had a phone call out of the blue about this. They know nothing about the harassment. I am the eldest of 7 and my mother in particular has enough worries without this. It really is the last thing either of them need to deal with. So Dr. De Campo, did those paragraphs have any influence on you in terms of how you responded in your emails to Ms. AWI?
I can give perhaps the same answer as I gave this morning, that I took the emails from AWI as a whole. There are different thoughts and emotions, quite understandably, in both emails, and my stance was to be respectful of AWI and engage with her. So I did, she had some major concerns that she wanted my reassurance about, and I gave her reassurance about those two things you have pointed out about the parents and publicity. Although I note that her stance changes a little in the second email to be more positive, more
That is the second email.
Yes. This is the second email. You're right. That she feels stronger about doing something about Harry, and but they come as a group of information that that's my only dealing with AWI, and so I relied on the emails as a whole to make some judgment about how I should respond as a person to another person who was in distress.
Thank you. You've given some evidence about advising the police or reporting this matter to the police. What was the purpose of you or the Royal Children's Hospital reporting this to the police?
My lay understanding of this is that police have the ability to investigate abusers and bring them to justice. The hospital is used to notifications to police for children, and in my judgment, view and on advice, it's important that a potential abuser or the allegations of abuse anywhere, but you might say in particularly at Children's Hospital, if that was that might have occurred, then the hospital needs to be absolutely transparent and public about that and achieve resolution as quickly as using the normal resources and forms that are available in our society. I have been asked, did I investigate? I didn't really see that as my role to investigate. That was for professionals to investigate. So it was important as part of transparency to make sure that the authorities knew that there could be a problem. They have to judge if they're, the truth of that in the end. But that's why I think it was within 7 days the police knew, and he was stood down. And I'm not sure how many days after we found out his name that occurred, but not very many.
You were in the hearing room when Ms AWI was giving her evidence, is that right? And you heard the additional paragraph that she read out in the hearing room. Is that correct? I just want to ask you a couple of questions about that. First of all, did you ever intend to discourage AWI from talking to the police or reporting this matter to the police?
No, I reported it for her.
Did you ever intend to discourage her from actually talking to the police once that report had been done?
No.
Okay. And did you ever intend to discourage AWI from taking other action, whatever action she may have regarded as appropriate?
Not at all.
Okay. Did you ever conceal anything in relation to this matter?
Not at all.
And did you act in the hope that it would simply all go away?
No. I'm going to add something to that, not to distress you, but just to add that the hospital's reputation depends on its actions and not on hiding things. That's completely unacceptable to me. And I have always acted, if you do the right thing, your reputation will follow you and not the other way around. So the hospital rightly has a good reputation, excellent reputation, because it's honest about what it does and tries to do better. And a reputation is not served by hiding facts. And that's been a long-held philosophy of mine, and I think it's served me very well.
Dr. De Campo, you've made a number of concessions in terms of things that you could have perhaps done differently or better, and I'm not going to go through all of those, but in terms of your actions and the steps you did take, were you acting in the way that you at the time thought was the best course forward?
Of course, I could have done things better, but I think that I was quite aggressive at trying to help AWI and to involve the police and get rid of the person from the precinct. We have discussed many things I could have done better, and they're on the record. And I'm sorry I didn't do them at the time. Many of them seem quite obvious now. Phone calls or investigations are very obvious 17 years later. And I'm surprised they weren't obvious at the time, but I didn't do them, and I'm sorry about that.
If Your Honour pleases.
Yes, Dr. Bennett, any questions? No. Yes, thank you, Doctor. Thank you for your evidence. You're now formally excused.
Your Honour, could I say something directed to AWI? She's maybe she's listening, maybe she's not, but I do respect and admire the courage that she's shown in coming to the Commission and in coming to me. It's a very brave thing to do and a difficult thing to do, and our society is better for it. She's enables us to examine how we can do better, how we can identify people who might be abusers, how we can stop employing people like that, and how we can care for victims. And her commitment to the Commission and the Commission process is fabulous, and I want to thank her directly for her courage. She was outrageously abused at the Children's Hospital, and there's no other way of saying it. It was completely unacceptable, and we have failed her terribly. You've to listen to her evidence this morning is the sad result of poor care in a children's hospital. And I'm sorry that we've caused that pain to her and her family, and it's been so many years of her life have been affected by what happened at the Children's Hospital. It's a small thing to say sorry for that, and it's a small thing to apologise, but I sincerely apologise for what happened. And I hope that it doesn't happen elsewhere, and I hope that the Commission will have an effect to reduce the risks of that in the future. Thank you, Your Honour.
Thank you, Doctor. Yes, Dr. Bennett, is probably to adjourn now.
Yes, Your Honour, we have one more witness, Professor Kilpatrick, so
Take a little
perhaps,
time.
yes, tomorrow.
Yes. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock.
Thank you.